and welcome to youth group. When you were little, did you and your friends ever make up stories together? Maybe you pretended to be pirates or monsters or superheroes. Since we're talking about adventures this month, at youth group on Sunday, we got things started by coming up with our own adventure story, Mad Lib style. Once upon a time, Shrek was sleeping when he bumped into Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker exclaimed, "Hola, let's go on a cool adventure." They texted their friends Han Solo, Spiderman, and Donkey and decided to meet at Chewie's to plan their trip. They decided they needed a cool name for their group of adventurers, so they called themselves the Pretty Tanks. Then Shrek said, "I have an idea. I heard about a Godzilla in Mexico that has been jackhammering everyone's lamps. Let's go defeat it." They all hit the road and headed for Mexico. Along the way, they played video games with mermaids and screamed at the devil and even used guns to battle an army of King Kongs. Sadly, Donkey died in battle from a gun wound to the fibula, and Spider-Man lost his ear when Han Solo accidentally hit him with a pickle. Finally, after a minute, the remaining members of the Pretty Tanks arrived in Mexico to battle Godzilla, who had been jackhammering everyone's lamps. Slowly, they approached the monster. As they stepped closer, the creature spotted them. It stood, looked at them with all three of its pink eyes, and shrieked. And then, that's it. What? You're wondering how the story ends? You want to know what happens to our heroes? Well, me too, but I don't know. The rest of their story hasn't been written yet. We've been focusing on our journeys towards knowing and following God. Last week, we started talking about sharing our own stories of faith. We said, no matter how recently you've met Jesus, and no matter how much he's changed your life, you are already invited to share that story with others. Your story is in progress, not complete, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't share it. I want to share a story with you from another person's faith journey. This is a guy named Paul. Ever heard of him? He's kind of a big deal. Let's take a look at a part of Paul's journey. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law in this place. And besides, he's brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed him kept shouting, "Get rid of him." As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, "I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison. As the high priest and all the council can themselves testify, I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring the people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed all around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" I asked. "I'm Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting," he replied. My companions saw the light, but they didn't understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. "What shall I do, Lord?" I asked. "Get up," the Lord said, "and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do." My companions led me by hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias came to me. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, "Brother Saul, receive your sight." And at that very moment I was able to see him. Then he said, "The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one, and to hear the words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard. And now, what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name." When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and heard the Lord speak to me. "Quick," he said, "leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me." "Lord," I replied, "these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him." Then the Lord said to me, "Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles." Paul went on to have many years of ministry after the moments just described in this passage. What we just read happened in the middle of his story, but he had clearly already had a pretty eventful life. First, Paul fought against Christianity and even killed those who followed Jesus. Then he switched sides completely and began to spread the meaning of Jesus. As a result, Paul could often be found in jail or in handcuffs because of his dedication to sharing his story with the world. Paul's story was a story about transformation. Sure, his story was pretty dramatic, but here's the thing. When you meet Jesus, your story becomes just as powerful as Paul's story, because your story is also about transformation. When Paul shared his story of transformation, he talked about who he was before he met Jesus, a man who murdered Christians, and who he became as a result of meeting Jesus. It's a simple idea, but it can be hard to put into words. Maybe you're still a little skeptical about your own faith story. Maybe you're trying to figure out who Jesus is and you aren't sure where it's all headed. Maybe you think your story isn't very interesting because you're too young or your life is just too boring. Maybe you've had a really hard life already and you'd rather not even think about it, let alone talk to other people about it. Maybe you're too ashamed to share your story because it would require talking about a weakness or a mistake that you're afraid to admit. Or maybe not. Maybe you know you have a story to tell and you are ready to share it. Wherever you are on your faith journey, you have a story to share, and sharing it is going to help you know God better than you ever have before. Whether you've known Jesus for years or you're still figuring out what you think about him, your story is just beginning, and that is pretty exciting. Your story is still in its opening chapters, and you and God are the co-authors of your story. Hopefully by now you see that you do have a story to share. But why should you share it? Here's a few reasons. Because someone needs to hear it. Just like the stories of transformation that we heard today, someone needs to hear how Jesus is transforming your life. They need to hear about the hope that you're finding in Jesus. Because sharing your story makes things clearer. Have you ever noticed that talking about something or writing it down helps you make sense of things? Faith works in the same way. When you talk or write about your story, it helps you see what Jesus has done for you more clearly. Because sharing your story makes you grateful. Have you ever written a letter or a thank you note or a message in someone's yearbook and realized mid-sentence just how much you're grateful for them? When we share how Jesus has changed our lives, it reminds us how much we have to be thankful for. Because sharing your story makes you brave. The more you share your story, the easier it gets and the more confident you become. And because sharing your story makes you grow. People think sharing your story is what you do after you've grown in your faith. But I have found that sharing your story is something that makes you grow in your faith. So what story are you writing with your life? What do you want your faith story to be? And how are you sharing that story along the way? Your story is in progress, not complete, and that is a good thing.